wine. Good. So over to Jonathan. Jonathan, I've known you for a number of years now, and it's been a real pleasure to watch the status of your wines deservedly gather more and more in reputation. It's been wonderful to see the wines evolve. It's been fantastic to build up my own cellar of your wines. As we have you here, could you begin by telling us a little bit about you, your wine journey, and where we are today? Thank you.
Well, usually you do me better than I do me, but basically, I was born in Africa. My father worked for a bank, and I worked in the oil and gas industry originally. When I was about 36, I got married, and my then wife said, I'm not really enjoying this because you're spending an awful lot of time in airplanes, so why don't we go somewhere and do something else? So I sold the business to a Swiss company, and I was on a restraint of trade for 4 years. We went to a place called Cahors, where we had friends, and we rented the house. And about 2 weeks in, I met a winemaker who learned his winemaking in Australia. And he said he couldn't sell his wine. So I said, well, I'm not doing an awful lot other than drinking a little earlier in the day, as you do if you're on gardening leave. And I rang this guy who used to work for Oddbins, which in those days was a huge company, it still is around. And I said, I didn't know how this works. He said, well, you send us a bottle and bug the hell out of us, and then we'll tell you whether to go away. And anyway, the end thing was that he bought half of this guy's production. So I said to my then wife, I said, well, this is a dead easy business, let's do this. And she said quite rightly, why don't you go and work for him and learn about winemaking? So I did, and I said, I'll work for you for free for a year. And I did everything from shoving cases into the back of boots and pumping over, and basically learned an awful lot, and realized fairly quickly that Cahors was maybe not Formula One, and Formula One was up the road. We couldn't afford the Medoc because they were very large properties. But in those days, Saint-Emilion was, the average size was about 3 hectares. So we bought Chateau Teyssier, which is the pretty house behind Tom. And we've gone? No? Okay. And I started making wine in '94. And it was, at the time, a guy called Robert Parker, who is now retired, but a phenomenal character, had basically said, I don't care whether your dad is a count or whether you've been, the property's been around for 500 years. If you make a nice wine and I like it, I'll rate it. So I thought this was a good idea, and we managed to buy a block next door to, a parcel next door to Angelus, which, as the French say, touched Angelus. And we renamed it Le Dôme, and that was in '96. And we did fairly well with it, and right from the offset, I thought, because I'd only been in the wine business, we didn't purchase the property in '94, I thought I was buying a lot of Merlot, which essentially was the idea, because you were supposed to, kind of do what Jack was doing at Le Pin. And it took about 6 weeks for my vineyard manager to turn around and say, you've bought an awful lot of Cabernet Franc. So, so luckily now, Le Dôme is noted as the greatest wine, or the biggest component of Cabernet Franc. And it took off, and luckily Bob gave us, for our 2010, 100 points. And in 2016, we've got another couple of 100 points, so that's 200 points. And we're making a wine which nowadays we're about to, with Lord Foster, construct a new winery next door to Angelus, and Canon, surrounded on all sides. And that will be available for us at the beginning of next year. So we're very excited about that, and hopefully it'll be the, not the full stop, but the extension of what we've been doing since '96. So that's really, and I also managed to pick up an OBE for winemaking as a result of the French ambassador, actually, who wrote to the English ambassador in Paris and said, why is this guy not being nominated? And so I'm the only Englishman who's got an OBE for winemaking. So that's like bigging it up, but there you go, Tom. You knew that.
Brilliant, Jonathan. Thank you. That was good to remind myself of the story. But it is a fascinating story, and I think for those who are joining this evening who are less familiar with Jonathan, with his wines and the story, it's really it's very, very special. I don't know if it's unique, but certainly heading out to Bordeaux when you did, you were really at the vanguard of this garagiste movement, as you referenced, with, you know, the rise of Robert Parker, the rise of the right bank, the smaller, more parcellaire approach to winemaking, which we've sometimes referred to as a more Burgundian approach, a more cru-based, a terroir-based approach to winemaking. Before we move into the 2019s, and by the way, I just mentioned in chat, everyone, please don't sit there with empty glasses. Whatever you've got to hand, you know, hopefully it's one of Jonathan's wines. If not, then, well, you know, that's okay too. But please do.
At least expensive.
Please do.
All those drinking Pinot Grigio, can you stop and put it away?
Yeah. But yes, you know, before we, or as we move on to discussing the 2019 vintage, maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about that particular approach of yours. For example, Ian has just mentioned on chat here, what do you mean by cru-based approach to winemaking? So perhaps you just unpack that slightly.
Sure. So basically, in the sort of late 90s and early 20s, everything that we did in Saint-Emilion was very sexy to the wine world, and we used to get everybody coming around, and it was all great. And then at the beginning of the 20s, the garagiste movement, which essentially was about making bigger wines, being a little bit extravagant. You know, instead of doing 100% oak or 80% oak, we would do 200% oak. So we would put the wine into barrels, new barrels, and then we to let it do its secondary fermentation, and then the further aging would be done in another set of barrels. So everything was done to excess because there was quite a lot of money flying around for small wines, garage wines. We were called garagistes because essentially Michel Bertin, who is the French equivalent of Robert Parker, was asked what he thought about these small, what we would call micro cuvées in those days. And he said they're so small that they could be made in a garage. So that's how, he didn't actually say it in a nice way. He was actually, you know, just being marginally whatever. And, but that's why we ended up being called garagistes. So the garagiste, which is used everywhere in the world, actually started in Saint-Emilion. But by the beginning of the 2000s, we'd become slightly out of fashion. We were doing things perhaps too much to excess. So it was a bit like those sort of, I don't know, Sex Pistols or Led Zeppelin, and other people were doing, you know, Gentle on My Mind or whatever. But so I thought, well, what the hell are we going to do to get the journalists coming back to see us and people coming back to see us? And I decided to, because we managed to pick up about 10 hectares up on the côte. So in Saint-Emilion, you have the plain, which does the sort of wines that Chateau Teyssier produces, which is a wine at 20, 25 quid, which is, if you like, a Sunday claret. But up on the hill, or the côte, you're talking about a way different scenario. And by then, we managed to pick up 10 hectares. And I decided that what we would do is we sort of copy slightly Burgundy in trying to make wines that were next door to each other, but in a very in different styles, although made in exactly the same kind of winemaking style, 80% oak, 20%, 80% new oak, 20% old oak. And as a result, the terroir, which is an overused word, but would actually shout and show a difference between the wines. And Bordeaux, although it talks about terroir an awful lot, essentially is not really about terroir. It's about blending. The first thing you have to learn in Bordeaux as a winemaker, it took me about 10 years to kind of like get it. Luckily, I had a phenomenal oenologist who is a guy called Gilles Bouquet, who's now retired and replaced by Thomas Declou, who is very looked after. But Gilles really taught me how to understand my palate, but that took about 10 years. But essentially, the concept of Bordeaux was changed in the 50s, and the idea was instead of making a wine complete, you would have a first wine, a second wine, a third wine. But essentially, they're all blended wines. They're not, they come from different parcels. We don't care whether it's the same parcel every year, as long as the overall wine is great. So that works very much on the Médoc. Whereas somebody like, for instance, Jacques Timpon of Le Pin makes a single vineyard, and I just thought that was great. But wouldn't it be great to do lots of different single vineyards? And so that is what we did, of which one is, well, all three of these are single vineyards, not Chateau Teyssier. Chateau Teyssier is a traditional Bordeaux blend. So that was the start of it, and luckily we managed to get the journalists back, and I think we're possibly one of the few companies that or businesses that do these single vineyard wines. We started, my ex-wife and myself, with 5.5 hectares in '94. We now have 60 hectares, which makes us one of the largest producers of wine in Saint-Emilion under their own marks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. And I think having introduced us to the different terroirs, the different crus, maybe let's turn now to the 2019 vintage specifically. And to give you a chance to catch your breath and have a quick glass of something, I'm just going to put the vintage in context for all our attendees. At our Bordeaux Summit, just last month, in fact, we did another online webinar similar to this, in fact. This was even earlier than the current sort of climate in terms of knowing about the quality of the vintage and how the wines taste. But we had Gavin Quinney, who, as well as owning Chateau Bordeaux, has been reporting on vintages in Bordeaux for Harper's, for Jancis Robinson's website, and for LiveX for the last 20 vintages. And he said 2019 is a really, really good vintage, up there with 15, 16, and 18. He pointed to the wet start to the beginning of the year, but the long, hot, dry summer, which he said gave wines which had some of the character of the 2018, but without the same roasty, toasty character, the very rich character. Then Jane Anson in Decanter last month suggests that the top right bank wines seem close to 2018 in style, rich and lush in many cases, although with slightly higher acidity levels than 2018. She goes on to say that Merlot was very successful with plenty of berry fruits and tannins, and the acidity ensured a more classical style with less gourmet richness than 2018. Finally, some interesting comments just this afternoon, hot off the press in James Suckling's Bordeaux report, from Thomas Duclos, someone you know very well, and I'm sure will tell us a bit about later, or your consultant, who said, I prefer 2019 to 2018 as the wines have this depth and density of the 2018 or the 2010, but with the sensuality and sexiness that you really enjoyed in 2015.
Did you say that?
Sorry, Jonathan?
Did you say that in French?
I very much doubt it. I certainly didn't translate it. I'd love to have heard it in the original. Yeah. And then finally, another interesting point that Thomas made, and I think it's very relevant to your wines, he said that what's been interesting in Bordeaux is that modern advances in winemaking mean that even great vintages can be enjoyed earlier, and that the 2019 is a great example of this. Lastly, your neighbor, Hubert de Bois at Angelus.
Who was the last guy?
That was still Thomas. That was still Thomas talking.
Thomas.
Yeah, and then finally, Hubert de Bois at Angelus was saying the wines in 2019 are the perfect wines for greedy wine lovers. So an interesting backdrop. I mean, clearly a lot of positivity there. Maybe you could tell us your thoughts on the 19 and then lead us through the 4 wines that we have in front of us.
Well, I think 2019 is the best vintage we've ever done. And basically, when you look at Bordeaux, I mean, I would say that because basically any vintage that you're about to sell is the best vintage you've ever done. But, however,
this time it's true.
Sorry?
This time it's true.
This time it's true. So basically, my experience in Bordeaux, and I've been there since '94, is that when you get a great vintage, it's always followed by another great vintage. So if you look at 2009, you have 2010 after it, 2015, you have 2016 after it, and 2018 has 2019. They're never actually the same in style. For instance, 2018 is a more opulent wine than 2019, but 2019 is more linear and more precise, and for me, a better expression of Bordeaux. You know, particularly some of the Côte wines that we're doing, they just have an unbelievable finish, but we'll get to that anyway.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the vintage, I'm looking at my notes here just to make sure I remember, but essentially it was, we had a fairly cold winter, which is always good because it kills diseases and everything else like that. Unfortunately, we had some frost, so there's a reduction in this wine, which is the biggest mark in Saint-Emilion. Sunday claret, but it has to be every Sunday because otherwise we can't pay the salaries. And that comes from the plain, but unfortunately we were frosted a little bit. First half of June, we had some rain, and then through July, a very hot summer for all these people who are into weather stuff. And then hot all the way through to the beginning of September, when luckily we had a little bit of rain. You know, people think sometimes that if you have rain, you're going to make a disastrous vintage. Actually, what you need is, it's like everything in life, it's timing. You know, you need rain at the right time, and we certainly had it in 2019. Beginning of September, we had a small amount of rain, which actually just pumped up the grapes a little bit and gave them freshness. And we picked probably a little earlier than we would do normally in most years. And then we brought the grapes in. A lot of people say, you know, you've got to treat everything gently and whatever, and we do everything. We hit the hell out of them. We do gentle as well. But basically, what we're trying to do is fine winemaking, which is essentially, I think, what Neil White, my head winemaker, myself, and Thomas are noted for. So basically, we bring it in. We put no sulfur on the grapes. We do a cold soak, which means taking the temperature down to. We basically put a lot of ice on it. So having treated them beautifully in sort of small carriers, we then blast the hell out of them with a ton of ice. Bring it down to 6 degrees. Keep it there for about 10 days, and then we do. Relatively rigorous pumping over, which means like round and round. It's better in French. It's called remontage, which sounds better than pumping over.
Yeah.
And then we use a thing nowadays called a turbo pigeage, which sounds sexy, but essentially it's like a drilling rig you put into the middle of a vat and it turns the whole vat over. And then at the end of it, we do the opposite. So we do gentle pumping over once every 2 or 3 days, and let the this is after the end of primary fermentation before we go into barrel. So that's the what you end up with is hopefully fine wine making with really great grapes.
Jonathan, and so leading us now into the Teyssier, the first wine we're going to try. Tell us, you obviously mentioned it was now the biggest single mark in Saint-Emilion, that's correct?
I believe so. And we've also ordered, sorry, not ordered, we've purchased a further 10 hectares in 2020. Mm-hmm. So this makes a production of 45 hectares, which for a single mark is pretty online. There it is.
Yeah.
A nice You must, except there's a tree on the way, but it looks better from you, from your side, Tom.
Yeah.
But, anyway, so basically, anybody's got a glass, we're going to have a swirly swirl.
Yeah. So just sorry, just so people are aware, the wines that Jonathan and I are drinking this evening, and the two of us alone, it's not that we're selfish or greedy, it's just these are barrel samples. So these have been specially drawn out of the barrels and basically prepared for us to taste this evening. So these are unfinished wines. These are the wines which trade and press and critics would have been trying during En Primeur week last month, in fact. And so, you know, there's a few of these bottles knocking around, but this is pretty much one of the very first times that they've been tried in the UK. So I'm having a little sniff now. And I was just writing a few notes whilst you were talking about Teyssier. This is 70% Merlot, 30% Cabernet Franc, and 25% of the malolactic takes place in new French oak.
25.
Yeah, 25. Yeah. So my note for this was that you've got this hit of black cherry, garrigue, dark chocolate, this kind of bouquet garni of charcoal and camphor. It's really quite complex. And then I think for me that the palate shows this quite chocolatey character, but with very well structured, juicy, long tannins. And actually rather more freshness on the palate than the nose immediately suggests, with some lovely kind of spiced plum and berry character.
I don't think I can add much more to that, actually, because
it really sets out your stall very encouragingly, I think. Jonathan is known for wines which have lovely, deep, plush, rich fruit, and what he likes to term cashmere tannins, which I think I've used on numerous occasions, and I think it's very fitting. But certainly with the Teyssier here, what is very noticeable is that freshness and that fine-grained acidity, which really gives it a nice kind of salinity on the finish. It's very, very drinkable indeed.
And I think the point is that, which is worthwhile noting, is that most wines from the plain are mainly Merlot, and the difficulty with Merlot sometimes is, as we get climate change, that the wine, unless it comes from next door to Petrus and Jack, you're going to get a little bit of, as time goes on, you're not going to get a great end. You know, Merlot is a plumpy wine, so it's kind of like the woman that you went out with, and Cabernet Franc is the woman you ended up marrying, and it needs the two of them to give a point final, or a finish on the end. And the thing about Teyssier is that this is a wine which is affordable. It's to drink now. You know, most people drink this within a year of us, not from now, but from when we bottle it, very happily. And it's the biggest amount of, I mean, we love Cabernet Franc, as you know, because of Le Dôme, but it's the biggest amount of Cabernet Franc on the plain that I'm aware of, allegedly.
Well, I know we've got a few people drinking some either bottles or even magnums of the 2015 Teyssier this evening. I'm sure if they would like to comment on the chat feed, they're very welcome. Be interesting to see how that's evolving. I'd imagine it should be tasting really rather nice right now. I've got some double magnums myself of Teyssier, which I think are just fabulous for kind of big parties, fun dinners. They look really, really the part as well. So a great entre de gamme wine for sure from the Maltus stable. Now we're going to move on to the Mazeyrat number 2. Maybe you can tell us more about this rather famous wine.
Okay, so basically Le Dôme and Mazeyrat used to be the same wine, owned by a couple of brothers. One brother died in 1990, and in 96 I was lucky enough to purchase the parcel that made Le Dôme. And then in 2008, his brother unfortunately had cancer, and I was the second caller and purchased the wine. So I'm a little bit of a grim reaper in this part of the world. But by then, Le Dôme was way more famous than VCM. VCM, for those of you who have the 08, the 08 was our first vintage of this. So this was a wine which was selling at an amount, and Decanter came along and saw us with our first vintage of 08, which we changed in style to our style. And they both basically touch Angelus left and right. So this is right, it's surrounded by Canon, and it's also where we're putting the new winery for the single vineyards and Le Dôme. And Decanter came along and tasted it, and they only gave 3 wines 5 stars in Saint-Emilion. One was Cheval Blanc, the second one was Ozone, and the third one was VCM. So we obviously put the price up for the 08, and it started with a bit of a bang. So if you have the 08 at home, which I understand you guys are selling, that's the first vintage of this wine. Vieux Chateau Mazeyrat is a bit of a mouthful, but it's basically, we call it VCM. And Robert Parker said, you know, that Vieux Chateau Setin, for those people who are into fine wine, when Bob Parker tasted this in 08, he said, there's a new wine on the block after VCC, which is VCM. So this is 65% Merlot. The rest is Cabernet Franc. The Cabernet Franc shouts a bit because it's basically, it's planted in 1947, which is just before the Great Frost of 56. And therefore, these roots go very deep, and it's clay over limestone, so it's quite punchy as a wine.
Yeah, it's again, just looking at my tasting note here from the nose and palate, there's a lot of lovely spice notes straight away. I've got some marzipan, nutmeg, some toast, but nice red character to the fruit as well. These kind of red cherries, herbaceous lift. Sometimes I find that the VCM has probably the sweetest, most sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of fruit, almost pastel character to the nose. But here, there's a rather nice kind of herbaceous lift, which is probably the Cabernet Franc to which you refer. The palate is luscious and ripe, but there's this really good backbone of acidity, and a very nice kind of succulent persistence. I actually find at the moment, and maybe it's obviously just barrel sample, youthful wine, but I actually find the fruit expression a bit more engaging on the palate than the nose right now, in fact.
Tom, although we are trying to sell this.
Yeah, yes, I think that was very positive, frankly. Yeah. No, I like the dimensionality of the wine. I think is really nice. I just think that the palate surprises with the precision of the fruit, more so than the nose at the moment. But yeah, it's lovely.
So just between these 2 wines used to be one wine, and obviously when we made Le Dôme famous in '96, this was less famous than when we bought it later, like a long 12 years later. So this is the reverse label of this. And in China, this is called Black Dome, not VCM.
Right. And then it would be interesting to see any comments from people who are trying the 2008, in fact. If anyone wants to comment on the chat, please do. If you've got questions that you'd rather ask live towards the end, then please do that as well. Jonathan, as a vintage, 2008 should be really drinking à point now. Is this a wine that if people have, they should drink up, or do you think it will continue to age and evolve?
Because 2008 is underrated in the same way that we're going to talk about Chateau Laforge 11. And basically, the reason for that is that we had at the end very cold nights and very hot mornings. So what you get is incredible extension of acidity on the wine. So initially when they came out, 2008, a lot of people thought they were a little bit short and etc. But acidity is the backbone of a wine along with tannin. And so they are drinking certainly, but this is a wine that could go on for a long time. It's a big wine. We're cropping this at 4 bunches to the vine, where we would be allowed to crop it at 8. So we're trying to make a wine which has some seriousness and yeah.
Well, we're certainly getting some nice comments about the 2008 from those attendees who are fortunate enough to have bottles. Oh, look at this, David! Wonderful deep richness, like a mysterious warm quilt. That I love this. I'm changing my tasting. Oh well, I'm drinking the 19, but I'm going to amend our tasting note on the website.
I'm not sure exactly where we're going with this, but
and how do you feel your wines age generally, not in terms of qualitatively, but stylistically? That, you know, that they are, I think you've mentioned before on occasion, you've been described as making kind of new world wines in the old world and old world wines in the new world. There's no shortage of fruit and ripeness and kind of plump, rich character. As the wines age, do they keep that? Do they mellow? How do you feel they evolve?
well, I think, you know, there's a certain side to us that, you know, prior to 2007 or prior to 2008, in other words, 2007, which is not necessarily the wildest vintage ever, was a change for Neil and I. And we decided, instead of doing 200% oak and trying to make wines as huge and powerful and to drink early, the 2007 changed it because there wasn't so much around, and we just decided in 2008. So we went from being like, within 2 years, 200% new oak, and really a little bit like Gary Glitter on steroids. Actually, that's not a good thought. Anyway, to in 2008, bringing it all the way back, picking earlier, doing 80% new oak, 20% 1-year-old oak, and just changing our whole approach to the wine. So I think that if you take us from 2007, darling, can I have a glass of water?
Yeah, sure.
That's great. Sorry. I think that from 2007, you know, we had a change in our lifestyle, if you like, and the way we make wine.
Fabulous. So moving on to Chateau Pontet-Labrie, obviously, well, not obviously to those of you who are joining us, but obviously to the 4 of us on the panel here, this is a wine that's very close to us in particular. This was a really, you know, important story for us at Honest Grapes, and we hope for you too, Jonathan. I remember it was back in 2014, oh no, I think it was early 2015, when you approached us and said that you had this last beautiful hectare of vines, you know, up on the plateau, with some wonderful old vine Cabernet Franc, which again predated the frosts of '57, and that it had previously been used to sort of bump up or to blend into other wines, because frankly, a hectare of vines, even in your parcellaire cru approach, really isn't commercially viable to make a single vineyard wine from. And yet you generously suggested that maybe it would be an opportunity for us at Honest Grapes to have a rather special, unique project, in fact, where you will make this this wonderful wine for us, a maximum of 300 cases when the vintage is good and there's no frost. Yeah. Well, we're trying to keep it up there for sure, and believe me, the demand is such. But before you talk a bit about the wine and the vineyard, just for our attendees to get a better sense of this wine, what Nathan and I decided would be a fun opportunity is, rather than selling the wine just normally by the case, we thought we would do something which was more of a combination of the classic Napa Valley allocation model, which Jonathan's very familiar with, having made wines out in California, which we might touch on at some point. We thought we'd combine that classic Napa allocation model with effectively more of a members club idea. The idea being that Pontet-Labrie, we now sell as part of a membership, as part of a club membership, in fact. So it's a certain number of vintages, and alongside the wine, you get access to some wonderful events, a great sort of our Grand Cru Class A wine concierge service, and all sorts of other jollies. And we've over the last 5 years, we've built a fantastic network of members, and it's become really good fun to be part of. Of course, I have to say, no offense to the 2014 Bordeaux vintage, but we were absolutely delighted to start this project with the 2015 vintage, and having had 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, you know, it's an incredible run of great vintages. So yeah, I'm going to pour myself a glass now because I've talked myself into a bit of a lather and I'm thirsty. But Jonathan, maybe you'll tell us a little bit more about the vineyard itself.
Sure. So basically, there is a Cru Classé called Chateau Grand Pontet, and this is right next door to the. It's literally right next door to the village of Saint-Emilion. To get through it, you have to go past the sign that says Saint-Emilion. And Tom, while you're in my house, anyway, so basically, if anybody knows Saint-Emilion, the police station or the gendarmerie is literally off the roundabout at the top of Saint-Emilion, and therefore this vineyard is very well looked after, and you know, guarded. It's basically the only parcel of the parcel that is called Grand Pontet that is not owned by Grand Pontet. So we're very lucky in that respect. If you come off the roundabout, the first sign you'll see is Pontet-Labrie, and it's 80% Merlot. The rest is Cabernet Franc, and what I think it gives you is quite a plumpy wine, but with a sort of linear and great tannins at the end.
Yeah.
So, but Tom probably will describe it better.
Well,
Neil gives me deep violet, mangetta hues, toasted oak, blackberries, cinnamon, licorice, black currants.
I have to say, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, I was I'm of course hugely biased when trying this wine, but I mean, it is an absolute stunner. And my tasting notes, I'm not going to read the full tasting note because it's quite long from the sample, but you know, I think that a few little key things I picked up here were, again, the impressive purity and focus, and a lot of complexity already. You know, it's not just primary, and what I really liked was there's this sort of raspberry jam, sandalwood, and vanilla pod, but then you've actually got some fresher notes of violets, and again this kind of red fruit character, which I haven't always seen in your wines. Actually, I love it. That freshness is there. So some ripe strawberries alongside the darker black cherries and berries, and then definitely this, well, I got a bit carried away here, whiffs of star anise, sourdough crust, cacao nibs, cumin, and tapenade complete the intoxicating bouquet.
What night did you write this?
This was about 10 minutes ago, actually. So, you know, no, when I tried the wines earlier. Then on the palate, you know, lovely tension and intensity, broad and long, so, you know, plumpy, as you say, but with penetrating kind of salty tannins wrapping protectively around this dark spiced red plum and blackberry core, dryly rich, some graphite, cocoa powder and toast, but nicely svelte with elegant fruit that persists well. I finished by saying it's a very different beast from the 2018, and I imagine it has a long life ahead, but perhaps to Hubert de Bois' point earlier on, it's interesting how, rather Thomas Duclos' point earlier on, it's interesting how accessible the wine is now. It's delicious. So congratulations and thank you.
I think that part of that we must remember, because we've sent these out to a number of journalists who were kind enough to get in touch with us, and so I think in June you'll start to see some notes coming in, but you have to remember also that we're tasting this in May, not April, and it's amazing how much 1 month. It would be great if we did en primeur a month later at this time, for instance, because I think you get a much better understanding of the wine. I think sometimes we kind of in Bordeaux rush to get it out because of the system that functions en primeur, but we can still do en primeur, but we don't have to show it so quickly. And I think that you're now seeing a better judgment of, even with en primeur week, normally I see a difference from the first guy I see to the last guy I see. The wine just changes. And I think this is a better indication of where the wine's going to be. And I love this. Like, what I love about Pontet-Labrie is the tannins on the end. Great.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, you'll certainly get no argument from me about putting the en primeur campaign a bit later and, when the wines are more ready to go. It certainly benefited me and my tasting. So last and certainly not least in our little lineup here, of course, we're finishing with Le Dôme. So let's talk about this one, please.
Okay, so Le Dôme, as I think I mentioned, when I bought it, I thought I was buying a lot of Merlot, but ended up buying a lot of Cabernet Franc. This is the biggest expression of Cabernet Franc in Saint-Emilion. And that's helped us really, because it does make it a wine to stand out. The nearest wine in terms of Cabernet Franc would be Cheval Blanc, and after that, perhaps Angelus. So Le Dôme is about 3.5 hectares, 80% Cabernet Franc, 20% Merlot. The reason for the Merlot is basically to give a little bit of plump in the middle. Cabernet Franc can be actually kind of flat. If you taste some of the Loire Cabernet Franc, sometimes they're a little middle, they're missing that sort of middle palate. Like every wine should really have like a story, really should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the Merlot, 20%, and it's really basically just a single parcel wine. So as I say, I think I bigged it up beforehand, but it's quite well known. It's reassuringly expensive. And, we got a couple of 100 points for it for the 2016. We had some numbers near that on 18 in terms of barrel samples, which means that when we put it in bottle, they'll rate it. But I think this is, my view, I think this is this is probably the best. I've had 2 people who've said wow to this, journalists. And I think this is probably the best Le Dôme we've made. I probably say that, but
It's really fascinating trying it after Merlot-based wines and the kind of sort of pivots onto Cabernet Franc. Again, that precision that and you have mentioned previously is really there. It's got so much sort of herbal character alongside the fruit. It's very linear. The finish is remarkable. I mean, it just goes on in waves as well. And it's beautifully refined. It's lovely, it's very refined. This kind of, cocoa dusted fruits on the palate, and definitely those cashmere tannins. I get on the nose. It's funny, I got it early and I still do now. I've got this kind of cocoa powder, coffee grains, licorice, black olive, but then alongside that, these more floral notes like rose petals, and even I found some sort of tarragon in there, in fact. And maybe that's the kind of slightly herbaceous Cabernet Franc character. And then underneath, you've got this wonderful richness, Dundee cake, cherries as well. It's a lot going on, both nose and palate.
And Neil agrees with you on the tarragon, by the way.
Really? Oh, that's great. That's very good. It's always nice when I say something sensible. um, Now, funnily enough, Andrew Palmer is asking what would we drink with it. I'm just wondering, Andrew, would you clarify which wine you're referring to? And one of the ones we've been discussing, or one of the ones you're drinking? And whilst you come back to us on that, any more comments, Jonathan, on Le Dôme and the 19 specifically?
Well, I think I've bigged it up enough, but the reality is that when we had when we do our assemblage, which means mixing and just seeing what the wines are like with Thomas and Neil back in February, we just all went wow. And when you taste some of these wines, I've got a thing in from I've got a well-respected journalist from Scandinavia, and his last word is awesome complexity, deep and length. This is a wonderful piece of clever winemaking. Wow! So when you get something like that, it's pretty good.
Yeah, that's hugely encouraging. You mentioned Thomas, your consultant, and I mentioned him earlier as well in his comments. I mean, he's really becoming, probably the most, well, unquestionably one of the most significant winemaker and enologists in Bordeaux at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm basically originally when I got to Bordeaux, there were two consultants. One was a guy called Michel Roland, who's very famous and still functioning. Functioning, so wrong expression. Still consulting.
Operating, still working. Yeah.
And the other one was Gilles Pouquet, who's now retired. And Gilles was the consultant for Cheval Blanc and Canon, La Consciente, and various others. And because my estate agent went to school with him, I managed to get him as my consultant. So I was very lucky. I went up the waiting list. It's like sort of being on the MCC and climbing up 20 years. And so I was very lucky. And then when he retired, his protege was Thomas Declos. And Thomas is very young. Well, I say in comparison to me, but he's in his 30s or whatever, and is a phenomenal taster. Really good doctor as well, because a lot of people use oenologues not necessarily for how the wine is going to come out on assemblage, because mainly Neil and I do that, but with his help. But essentially, when you screw up on a wine, an oenologist is somebody who basically is like a doctor who helps you get the wine going right. And life, everybody's from time to time, and he's really good at that, and he is, and he's being 3 years ago nobody knew him, and he's now like on an upward slope, which is fantastic.
It's fascinating for me personally, because the only other 2019 barrel samples that I have tried thus far, not of course having been out to Bordeaux for the En Primeur week, were by complete coincidence Razin Segler and Chateau Canon, which were brought over by Olivier, the global brand ambassador for those two chateaux, for an event that we were hosting with Holland and Holland, actually. And it was a bit of a treat and a surprise. And of course, getting to try those wines, assuming that I'd be drinking a whole load more different Bordeaux 19s in a few weeks afterwards, and then this gap until now. But it's fascinating how obviously Canon is very close to you. Thomas is consulting there as well, and there's definitely a nice sort of progression between the two chateaux, Canon and your wines as well. So it's great to see that continuity and class of the vintage. I think.
Yeah, I think one has to be slightly careful, because Michel Roland is known for the fact that he encourages people to be opulent and that sort of thing. And Thomas, like Gilles, supports people of different viewpoints. So for instance, within his stable, if you like, or people he consults with, we're certainly on the most opulent side of the wines that he makes. Take, Cheval Blanc is quite discreet, and Calon's becoming slightly more opulent, but within the stable of people who he works with, and he accepts the fact that the winemaker and the owner have different viewpoints about the way they want their wine to be, and he supports that. And I think that's the mark of a good oenologist, as opposed to somebody who wants to impose a style of wine, which I think was much more of the fashion about 10 years ago. We're probably going off into the realms of wine fantasy here. So
no, but I think that's fascinating that, ultimately it's the job of a consultant and of a winemaker to bring out the quality of the terroir and the best that's within the grapes, rather than imposing their own blanket ideas of making all wines taste the same. I mean, not to do Michel Rolland a disservice, but there is that famous scene in Mondovino where he says, grapes are the raw material and the wine starts with me. So I think, the rather more humble, hands-off approach is definitely one that we can encourage.
Humble we're trying to do, but
yeah, and you're nothing if not humble, Jonathan. Nothing if not humble. But perhaps as well, we could just talk a little bit about a couple of the other wines which various people are trying. We've certainly got a fair bit of La Forge 2011, and I think that vintage is one which is well worth commenting on, in fact, the 11 vintage. And then we've got a few people, I think, apart from the Teyssier I mentioned, that's floating about variously. I know we've got a little bit of the La Croix 16 as well. So perhaps a few words on the La Forge 11 and the La Croix 16.
Sure. So basically 11 is a way underrated vintage, like 2001 was. When it came out, it was dirt cheap. Well, not dirt cheap, but for Bordeaux, but was too cheap because it followed 2000, which was more famous really because it's 2000 rather than actually the value of the vintage. And 2001 was 2000, but with better tannins on the end. And the same about 11. It followed obviously on from 2010, which is pretty historic. And we got 100 points for Le Dome for that from Parker, from Bob. But 11, I think, is hugely underrated. I think it has a great longevity. And Chateau La Forge is the wine we drink at home. It's from the plain, but it's fairly grand. Whereas we crop this at about 6 bunches, we're cropping Chateau La Forge at 4 bunches. And it's getting 80% new oak. It's getting basically the same kind of vinification that the rest of these grand ones do. And obviously it's not the same price, but it's also 92% Merlot, which is the biggest expression of Merlot we do, and 8% Cabernet Franc. But it comes from 3 different terroirs. Sorry to bring the word up, but essentially gravel, clay over limestone, and sand. And those are the 3 terroirs from Saint-Emilion. So that's Chateau La Forge. La Croix is obviously a Bordeaux Superior, so it's not as grand as the other 2. But it's from the 2016 vintage, which a part of the 2018-19 is one of the best vintages that we've had. As I mentioned, I think we got 2 100 points for our Le Dome 16. So even at a low level or a lower level, Bordeaux Superior, you're drinking a wine that's in excess of where it should be.
I think jumping in, Jonathan, I think, as you know, I'm a big Burgundian. And so when I come to Bordeaux, I take quite a cynical view of critics and their point scores. So while I'm delighted that you've been showered with so many points, but actually the thing that I love most about your wines is that I've found in wine it's better for me personally to follow the terroir, to follow the place, and then to stay with that. And so often when whatever critics score a place, like in Burgundy, I love following a place through the years. And that's what I noticed so much about your single vineyard cruise. I wonder if obviously you know, we all love it when critics give high scores, and probably you must get terribly annoyed when people give you low scores. But for me, it's the Burgundian-ness, at least in terms of following that sense of place that your wines have. Whereas most Bordeaux to me feels too much like a mélange, you know, rather like a cuvée of champagne or something, where it's all in a house style rather than in the expression of the place.
Well, I think you're referring back to what I said earlier, which is the reality is that Peyraud, who was the most important oenologist, just after, when I learned my winemaking, I had to read his book and learn it, and it was all very difficult. But he was the guy that did this concept of let's blend wine and just make, we have a first wine, we have a second wine, we have a third wine. And a lot of people say, you know, well, that's Bordeaux has terroir, but it actually doesn't really express that, because essentially it's an expression of blending, which is not what you like from Burgundy. And hopefully we, you know, with wines like Pontet-Labrie, that's what we're actually kind of like doing, because I'm expressing single vineyards. Le Dôme is a single vineyard, Pontet-Labrie is a single vineyard, VCM is a single vineyard, and I think, you know, I'm very much impressed by the work that Jacques Tiampon did at Le Pin from 88 to 92 and where it's gone since. But Jack just does this from one vineyard, and I think that's great.
So just picking up a couple of questions. So Andrew's come back and said the food pairing he was asking about was what would you drink with Le Dôme? And Alistair has said, could you compare Le Dôme 19 and 15?
Well, could you answer? I'm really not good at pairing. Tom, could you answer the pairing, and I'll do the comparison?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I would pair a good drinking vintage of Le Dôme with a touch of age, like the 15, which Alistair's drinking for the first time. You know, for me, that just cries out for red meat. You know, it cries out for a really good steak. I remember going to that little place in Sauternes where they just do the Charolais beefs cooked over the vine stems with a very simple red wine reduction and some frite. I think the more complex and nuanced a wine like Le Dôme, frankly, the more simple and straightforward the dish you want to accompany it with. So I would struggle to get away from red meat here. Apologies for the vegetarians amongst us this evening. I'm sure a similarly rich sort of aubergine-based dish would probably do the job. Mushrooms, yeah, you know.
Lobster.
Pairing for Pontet-Labrie would be nothing. Don't drink it yet. So, I mean, having said that, the plushness of some of the wines with that lovely core of tannin makes it dangerously approachable at an early age.
Yeah.
We are available to sell you salmons, you know, mixed with Merlot or Cabernet Sauvignon, as they do in Napa. It's amazing when you go to Napa. They cut up the vines and they put them into Cabernet Sauvignon, and you put that on your fire so that when you walk into the house, you have the smell of Cabernet Sauvignon.
Fantastic.
And this could be a new business opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, it's just a question of anyone walking into my house. There's probably an open bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon somewhere, so it normally smells like that anyway. But yeah, I like the vine idea too, even in the smokeless zone, sadly, in London. So to Alistair's question, Jonathan, about comparing.
19.
Yeah,
that's a difficult one, because I think that 15 is more like 18 for me, because they're quite, you know, open wines. 16 and 19, I think, have more persistence. But you know, neither is wrong or, you know, or right. Basically, you can drink, I think, 15 and 18 before you'll be able to drink 16 and 19. If you're kind of into that. I mean, you know, a lot of people in America, for instance, don't care about aging wine. They basically, as soon as the wine arrives from Screaming Eagle, they'll take the cork out and say, let's try this baby now. So it really depends on what your style of requirement of freshness, tannin, and age is.
And I think to just re-emphasize that, another interesting point. Funnily enough, this was another comment from Michel Roland on the 19 vintage. Was rather like you were comparing back-to-back vintages as well, and saying that you often get two great vintages back to back, but they're not the same style. He was saying that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. He was saying that 19 is to 18, what 16 is to 15, what 10 is to 9. Would that be a pretty good summation of these 6 5-star vintages?
Yeah.
Good. Excellent. If you'd said no, that would have been a waste of 30 seconds of everyone's lives. So
I don't want to put my career up against Michel Roland. So
well, he is still he's still functioning.
Anyway,
so better not. Yeah.
One thing, just if you can cross your fingers, in Bordeaux we have a thing called the Luna Russe, which means the Russian moon, and it's occurring tomorrow. And if we get beyond it, we don't get frost.
Wow. Okay.
Please cross fingers for us.
Definitely. Everyone, you heard that? That's your one big request. Well, there'll be a couple more later, but that's a big request is please do keep fingers crossed for the lunar moon going well. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I think we're moving into the last sort of 15 odd minutes or so of the session. Were there, I hope we've answered most questions that have come through on the chat. Were there any other questions specifically or comments that people wanted to make live or otherwise? Was that someone coming on? Well, anyway, whilst if you do want to raise your hand and ask something or put something on the Q&A, please do. Meanwhile, I'll just mention a couple of things. Firstly, I mentioned right at the beginning our Bordeaux Summits that we hosted last month, which was really fascinating. We had an expert panel, including Gavin Quinney, I mentioned, Rupert Miller, who's the fine wine editor of the Drinks Business, also their Hong Kong editor. And we also had Nick Martin, who runs a peer-to-peer trading platform for fine wine and has been a wine collector for about 30 plus years. We had a very spirited discussion about Bordeaux, about wine collecting, about, frankly, the current situation going on in the world, of course. You know, we haven't really dealt with or chatted about the coronavirus. Perhaps now is not the time. It seems to haunt our days and everything else. But the result of that was we published a report, a Bordeaux report, which we had also got the feedback from about 100 wine collectors, over 30 wine trade press and critics. And we've turned that into a really rather interesting report, which is basically wine collecting and wine investing with Bordeaux, you know, post-COVID. So for anyone who is interested, we're very welcome to, we'd love to make that available to you. So you just need to let Charlie know when he follows up with everyone later this evening or tomorrow morning. Now we've got a few questions coming in here. Gerald is wondering, Jonathan, about the level of sulfites in your wine.
Yeah, well, two points on sulfites. Firstly, you need them, otherwise, but you only really need them during aging. About 5 years ago, we did the normal thing, which was putting sulfur on as soon as the grapes came in, put them in a vat, shoved a whole load of sulfur on it, and then descended it down to 6 degrees. Now we don't do that anymore, and the wines are much plumper, much more expressive. So essentially the minimum amount of sulfur, which is not good for your head. You know, if you drink Australian or New Zealand or South African, you know, white wine, you probably have a headache the next day because there's a lot of sulfur that goes in it. But we try and keep the sulfur to the minimum that we can. Unfortunately, you know, the reality is that wine is an unstable product. So when we're tasting these, for instance, as Tom and I appear to be the only people allowed to do that, you know, they've only just been sent across the channel. They appear to be the only people who are allowed to do that currently, but they're unstable. In other words, we could have opened one of these and it would have been a disaster, and we don't want that for our clients.
We had another question here from Katinka asking, what is the big difference in taste between percentages of blends? Is there a big difference between blended and non-blended? Katinka, I'm assuming, apologies if I'm wrong, I'm assuming you're meaning a blend of different grapes or a blend of different vineyards, a blend of different grapes. So grapes, thank you. So Jonathan, yeah, I suppose obviously we had 3 wines which were predominantly in different amounts, Merlot, and then the Le Dôme Cabernet Franc. What's the difference?
So basically, there are 3 predominant grape varieties in Bordeaux. Merlot, which is the biggest producer in Bordeaux, and then you have Cabernet Sauvignon, which is more famous in the Medoc, which means the left bank rather than the right bank, or as we say, the wrong bank rather than the right bank. And that was funny.
Still get me.
Thank you. And the minority is Cabernet Franc. So basically, Cabernet Franc is the daddy of Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon is a mix of, in terms of vine variety, between Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc. So Cabernet Franc has slightly more softer tannins, which we call Cashmere tannins, and Cabernet Sauvignon has slightly harsher tannins. So you tend to drink the Cabernet Sauvignon a little later. In terms of the 3 varieties, Merlot gives you the plumpiness and the middle palate. Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon give you the final bit of the wine. So that's like the full stop. Every wine, you know, any wine should not just like taper off into a plumpness and awfulness, which a lot of wines can do. It should have a final finish, even if that is with persistence. So for instance, years ago when I presented Le Dôme to a guy from one of the wine merchants from Pall Mall or around there, and I was his last visit, and he was going to Bordeaux Airport and then going on to Gatwick, London, and he tasted Le Dôme and he said, "Jonathan, that'll still be with me when I get to London." And that's essentially what you want. You still want a full stop on the wine, but you still want this sense of persistence that goes on forever.
Absolutely. We had a fun question here from an anonymous attendee who I think it's actually Michel Roland, funnily enough, who's saying, aside from your own wines, are there any other right bank wines you're particularly fond of? Anything in the £20 to £30 price bracket that you're a fan of? Thanks, Michel.
Okay, right bank. So basically, my favourite and for me the most expressive Saint-Emilion that I've ever tasted, and I would love to emulate, is Beauséjour Deux Fois la Garosse 1990, which blew my head apart and made me love Saint-Emilion. But that is unfortunately not in that price bracket. But if you take a lot of wines that are made by people like Michel and Ronan from Pomerol, and you take their second wines, which sometimes don't necessarily come from Saint-Emilion, but they come from the Côte de Castillon or they come from Bordeaux, they're very interesting wines and they are incredibly affordable.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Are there any more questions? I don't see any on the chat or on the Q&A there, but whilst people are rounding up their final thoughts, I hope everyone will forgive me for once again mentioning Club Pontet-Labrie. we are open for a few more subscriptions, a few more members actually, and there are effectively membership comes with a number of vintages. It could be 3, it could be 5, it could be double cases. I won't go into details, but we'd love any of you who are interested in learning more about Jonathan's wines, who would be interested in finding out more about Club Pontet-Labrie. We've certainly got a number of members joining us here this evening, and hopefully they'll all say nice things. If not, please be quiet. But no, it's great to see you all here. Oh, I've got another little question. Mr. Anonymous Attendee comes in. So I think now is as appropriate time as ever to mention that you, as well as being a 100-point awarded OBE winemaker, with a winery that's being designed by Lord Norman Foster, Jonathan also is a keen musician as well, and he's not going to play for us this evening.
He's not going to play. He's not going to play.
But he's not going to play. But, yeah, the CD. Yeah.
And so, on Spotify in 2 days' time.
And we will be making it available as well through Honest Grapes. Maybe Jonathan, you could just briefly tell us how this album came about, and just why not, for fun.
It's a vanity project. I did it last year with a good friend, and we went to Abbey Road Studios, which was great fun, to sit in a canteen that John Lennon had sat in, and we did. I wrote a whole load of songs when I was in my early 20s, and I've written one song since, which is about my partner, and
Get it there. It's anyway, very good. Your influences are well recorded, I have to say. No, it's good fun. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for joining.
You mentioned about 67 Pall Mall on the 6th of June.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. For those who are either members of 67 Pall Mall or fancy joining for a virtual membership, which they're now offering, on the 6th of June, if you're feeling a bit hard done by, because Jonathan and I have 4 bottles in front of us and you probably had at most 2, then 67 Pall Mall will be doing an absolutely stonking tasting of maturing vintages, where we send the bottles to 67 Pall Mall, the wonderful wine club, which we're all members of, and then they will siphon them off into small 73 cl measures into these small glass bottles using Coravan, argon gas, etc., and they'll send them out to you 48 hours before the tasting, and you'll get to try 6 wines, 6 of Jonathan's wines. As I said, there'll be more maturing vintages than the ones you've tried this evening, as well. And yeah, we'll certainly be able to send details of that. That will go live on 67's website tomorrow. Well, basically, as soon as I get the pictures over and the title for the tasting, which I think we just agreed earlier today. Brilliant. Well, I think hopefully I've not missed anything off. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for your commentary. Thank you obviously for producing yet another stonking vintage. We are very much looking forward to what we hope will be the imminent release of these wines. I know we can't wait to get our hands on them. And I think anyone else, and I hope that's a number of you who are interested in Jonathan's wines, please make sure you keep in touch with us. We're hoping to have an interesting announcement very, very soon about the release of the 2019s. And I can no pressure, but yes, pressure. But I can promise you they really are well worth being in every serious or even frivolous wine collector's cellar.
I just want to add one thing to that is that although obviously I'm interested in talking about my wines, I'm also very proud to be a part of, Formula One, which is Bordeaux, and any part of Bordeaux is fantastic. So let's think about that.
Very good. Very good. Absolutely. Very, very ecumenical. Marvelous. Well, thanks once again, Jonathan. Thank you very much. All our attendees this evening, Honest Grapes clients and club members and Pontet-Labrie club members. Thanks again to 7IM and all of your guests this evening. It's wonderful to see you all here. Yeah, and we have a number of online events of one stamp or another, various grower tastings, our wine therapy sessions. We'd obviously be delighted if you'd like to join us for more of those. And I know Charlie will be in touch later this evening or first thing tomorrow with some more details about that. Brilliant. Well, I'm just going to, it's always traditional, I think, to raise a glass at these things. So I'm going to have a final little sip of Pontet-Labrie. Some of you commented I was using a spittoon, but certainly not for this. And once again, thank you very much for joining us and see you for another session soon, I hope. Thank you.